Okay, audience are beginning to join on. We'll start promptly in about 1 minute. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody from here in Singapore. Good morning to those of you who are joining us from Europe as well, as I know some of you are. I'm Chris Humphrey, the Executive Director of the EU-ASEAN Business Council, and welcome to this, our latest webinar, which is looking at the reorientation of ASEAN supply chains for a sustainable future. The background to this webinar is, of course, that international trade is a cornerstone of the global economy. It's allowed countries to expand their markets and improve access to goods and services, whilst also increasing competition, lowering prices, bringing cheaper products to consumer, and helping to alleviate poverty through job creation and employment. There are, however, as with most things, some downsides in that trade is not always environmentally or socially responsible. However, I think it's fair to say that pressure is mounting from consumers, from investors, from regulators, and indeed from NGOs, for companies to clean up their act. Particularly, supply chains account for the bulk of the carbon footprint for most consumer goods, which is unsurprising given the journey from raw material sourcing to energy-intensive production, storage, delivery, and transportation, often across multiple jurisdictions. It is true, though, that many companies are realizing that making their supply chain sustainable can lead to greater productivity, efficiency, and cost savings, as well as partnership opportunities and stronger brand reputation. These are high payback investments that are beneficial not only to businesses, but to the environment and society at large. Implementing sustainable practices also translates into increased transparency and traceability, which are important to ensure that supply chains are resilient to withstand future shocks. A hard lesson learned from the current and ongoing global health crisis. So today we will be looking at a number of different issues connected with this and asking some pertinent questions of our panel today. Questions such as, how can companies ensure their supply chains are more sustainable? How can they boost efficiency and traceability? What role can the financial institutions play in helping with sustainable trade finance and putting in place sustainability initiatives in supply chains? And what's the role of governments as well in helping businesses accelerate ESG transition? And finally, where is ASEAN at on this very important key issue? I am joined here today by a very esteemed and very experienced panel. First off the bat, shortly will be His Excellency Satvinder Singh. He's the Deputy Secretary General in charge of the ASEAN Economic Community at the ASEAN Secretariat. He's joining us from Jakarta. We've got Surath Sengupta, who's the Global Head of Trade Portfolio Management, Distribution, Financial Institutions and Sustainability, HSBC, who I think is joining us from London today. We have Stephen Beck, who is the Head of Trade and Supply Chain Finance at the Asian Development Bank. We have Ronnie Tam, Director of Global Sourcing at Walmart, who's joining us from Shenzhen in China. And finally, we have Frank Vector, who is the Group Treasurer and Insurer at Puma, who is joining us today from Germany. Good afternoon and good morning to you all, gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us here today for this webinar. Very much looking forward to the discussion. For the audience, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Put your questions in there. I'll do my best to pick them up and direct them to the right people on our panel today. And please don't be shy in asking those questions, otherwise it becomes a monologue from me directing questions at these esteemed gentlemen. We'll kick off the discussion, and I'll kick off with DSG Satvinder Singh, if he doesn't mind, please. And perhaps you can just give us an overview of where you believe ASEAN is in terms of trade sustainability. And as the region continues to grapple with suppressing COVID-19, can countries in Southeast Asia realistically put sustainability on their agenda?
Thank you, Chris. Very good afternoon to you and to my esteemed fellow panelists. So good to be part of this team. Yes, for me, Chris, let me just start. I mean, for me, when you ask me about trade sustainability, again, for me, when I think about sustainability and trade, I think first thing for ASEAN, it's truly about our commitment of wanting to be open for trade and investment, despite all of that disruption that's been brought about by the pandemic and all the supply chain disruption issues. So keeping markets open and building access to new markets truly have been one of the key stalwarts of the ASEAN leaders in their commitment towards sustainability and trade. And I think the best testimony to that about keeping markets open and the ASEAN push is towards open markets and investment is truly the way the leaders have come together last year in completing the RCEP negotiation agreement. And here we have in making in the next couple of weeks, actually, it's not even months now. Hopefully by early January, we will actually have one of the largest FTAs in the world ready for ASEAN region and its member partner countries, the 5 of them, Japan, Korea, China, New Zealand, and Australia, together, coming together like never before, having an open access market, eliminating any protectionism, managing all of that roughness that you see in global trade and dealing with the difficulties of some of the largest, most challenging economies of China, Japan, and Korea. So to me, that for me is sustainability to the best level. Of course, when you talk about trade sustainability, the other thing that comes to my mind definitely is the urgent need to make it more efficient, to make it more transparent, to make it more digitalized. And again, this is not just G2G, but also G2B, and then again, B2B. And I think the good news from the ASEAN side is when it comes to governments trade facilitation, we've done extremely well in the framework of the ASEAN single window today. Almost we have ready. Honestly, almost all of the ports, including all of the customs, are able to transact using digital forms, Form Ds, and the capacity is there, the capability is there. But then again, is the volume of digitalization happening the way we want? The answer is no, because when it comes to the ground, it's still not easy for the ground. The custom authority is still having difficulty in making sure that the volumes of trade documentation in the digitalization form to take precedence. The other area, of course, the next big thing that I see in trade sustainability area is, of course, still in the strain of digitalization is really going to be about how do we make our commercial trade paperless, and I'm hoping that day comes very soon. I know COVID has brought us closer to it. For the first time, we are seeing global banks, even in Singapore, I understand, or even in Jakarta, they're accepting digital signatures now. But again, that honestly wouldn't have come if it's not for COVID. And obviously, there's no looking back. I hope we are looking forward, and more of our ASEAN member countries will come forward and be able to change their legal regimes to accept the digital documentation, the commercial documentations in the court of law, especially in disputes and in transfer of assets between the buyer and seller. So that itself is the large chunk of work that we still need to be addressing in order to move towards sustainability in the direction of digitalization and paperless trade. But I think more importantly, as we move forward, it's very clearly that all these important changes we see in trade, we have to take it alongside all of the areas that are happening when it comes to sustainable financing is happening as we see it. There's also the energy transformation that's taking place alongside us. And then there's also, of course, the embrace of circular economy notions, not only the rest of the world, but even in ASEAN, we have actually now, just this year, we have actually come up with a framework on circular economy. And this will be the start towards our own journeys towards wanting to organize our ecosystems towards a low carbon future. And I think we can definitely look forward and we can expect conversations around sustainability gaining momentum in many, many ways. But I think this is where at the crossroads of all of this, the finance, circular economy, and the decisions of business owners, the decisions of businesses like all of you, I think this is where, the fire hits the road. And I think this is where I think the conversations are needed. And I think while governments are beginning to embrace some of these commitments and look forward to it, I don't think we are anywhere close towards having created the right ecosystem that's going to facilitate some of this, the conversion towards sustainable future for our private sectors. And I think there's a lot to be done in that space. But at this stage, I do feel that the drive, don't look to the governments to drive this at this stage, but I think this is where I believe the drive, especially in the ASEAN, should come from the private sector more, because I think the private sectors will be far more equipped because of your global practices all over the world to be able to bring the best of class of actions into our region and then show the way to the rest of ASEAN. And to me, for the private sector, you guys are in a very good position to do this, and you're not doing this just to help all of us, but also in order to be relevant, to your customers and to your clients and to your stakeholders. I think the way forward towards sustainability is the kind of the only way. Now, the only thing I'm a little bit worried, and I hope to hear from my fellow panelists, is more, will the financial sustainability sector be there to support us as we move in our transitions in various ways, whether it's logistics, whether it's energy transformation, or even other kinds of transformation need. I think that's where I think it's really all open whether the support is going to be there for all of us. Back to you, Chris.
Thank you very much. You covered a lot of ground there. I must say, very thought-provoking. I like the analogy. We're at a crossroads of finance, or circular economy, or business decisions, and all the other elements you mentioned there as well. Stephen, I'll come to you to try and pick up on some of those themes that DSG came up with. I mean, perhaps you can try and give us your view of what ASEAN as a region, not just government, but all of the region, stands to miss out on if it doesn't move more on greening of supply chains, or the other sustainability elements there that DSG mentioned. Particularly when you think about the huge number of SMEs we have here in Southeast Asia, who may not be well as equipped as the big boys to put in place some of these measures.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. Pleasure to be with you guys. Thanks very much for the invitation. For those of us from Europe, I should just explain very briefly what Asian Development Bank is. No doubt our ASEAN colleagues know, but I think a lot of Europeans are not as aware of what Asian Development Bank is. So ADB was created in 1966. It was placed, its headquarters is in Manila, Philippines. It's owned by 68 shareholder governments, including G7, and if not most European countries, many of them. And the mandate, of course, is to basically to improve people's lives. And for the first 40 years of ADB's existence, by and large, it focused on big infrastructure projects with governments, loans to governments for infrastructure projects, as well as budget support. And then only over the past 15, 16 years has it developed a capacity to work with the private sector to help its developing member countries move up the development curve. And so the trade and supply chain finance business has been established, and that's what I look after. So we're at a critical time. I think everyone will agree certainly on the environmental front, and this discussion is very timely just before we're about to head into some of these COP24 discussions and so on. But the interesting thing about the very high level sort of government discussions is that one could maybe say that by and large they're aspirational, right? There are some broad sort of targets that are established, but how do those get implemented? And that's I think really what we're here to discuss is how do we actually see real change throughout supply chains which run through the economy, so that we can actually achieve all of the sort of goals we have on the environmental front. And of course, there's also the human rights issue that we need to be mindful of, and labor standards and so on throughout the supply chain. So and this is where we come in to actually put these things into practice. But of course, it's easier said than done. And I think that one of the things that we all need to do is to drive more transparency through supply chains. And without that transparency, we're not going to be able to have that sort of window, that ability to monitor and verify that we're doing what we want to be doing on the environmental and social fronts. And I think we still need to innovate a lot of techniques and mechanisms and tools to be able to do that efficiently and cost effectively. So this is a big challenge. Satinder mentioned digitization. There's no question that that's going to be playing a very important role. And so I'll just mention briefly that Asian Development Bank teamed up with the government of Singapore and the International Chamber of Commerce to create the Digital Standards Initiative, which is developing the protocols and standards to be able to drive interoperability between a lot of different fintech, but other platforms as well. And we also hope that we will be able to underpin seamless digital trade through the entire trade ecosystem, meaning from exporters to shipping to ports, customs, warehousing, finance, and importers. And if we can do that, aside from all the productivity gains and so on that can come out of that, if we can do that, then I think that we'll be able to achieve a level of transparency that will help us achieve that sort of level of visibility that will enable us to move up the curve on the environmental and social fronts. So that's very exciting. I know that ASEAN is plugged into that initiative. And just one other thing, Chris, in response to a Satinder question, will the finance community be there? I firmly believe that the finance community wants to be there, and I think is in some respects arguably leading this some of these efforts, because for the financial community it represents risk, right? And this is really a very interesting area where if we can do a better job of tying E&S to the risks involved in transactions, and if we can delineate between lower risk and higher risk, and if then we can translate that lower risk to a different capital treatment from regulators, we can embed systemically a lower pricing for sort of responsible E&S transactions. I'll leave it there for now, Chris. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm turning to Sarath now, and it wasn't a question he had given to him beforehand, but now two panelists have asked the question, and I would be remiss not to ask it. Sarath, can the finance sector step up to the plate to help with sustainability in supply chains?
Yeah, no, thanks, Chris, and pleasure to be here with such esteemed panelists. So thanks for the invitation. If we just step back a little bit before I sort of answer your question, I just want to step back and just look at what is happening in this space and what's the evolution, right? So if we look at companies, right, companies moved from being focused on profits. So if you look at the 20th century, companies were driven by profits as their key enabler. Then they moved into shareholder value, so total shareholder value becoming the key driver. And now companies have moved to total societal returns as the driver. So as their customers, their investors are asking them for a societal bond. So it can't just be shareholder value is not enough. It is this total societal returns. And that is then driving a significant shift. So we did an aggregator survey which shows that 85% of companies see environmental sustainability as a priority, right? And 9 out of 10 look at COVID as post-COVID transformation as the impetus that is required for this transformation. So there is already significant business momentum there. And that is then being supported by policy momentum, which Satinder also spoke about. So the governments are now, so the key trading blocs like the EU, ASEAN, China, US, etc., starting to step up and with key policy momentum behind this. Now what is required is the next thing, which is around how do we take it to the next level? So financing has already started happening, but it is happening in a co-created manner, which is important. So the work that we've done with some of our panelists companies out here, whether it's Puma, whether it is Walmart, etc., is on a co-created basis, which means we have worked with them to help their sustainability agenda into their supply chains and really drive financing the supply chains to affect the transition, help the transition in that space. But for this to happen at scale, which we want to do, we don't have a choice out here. I don't think this is it's like a choice out here. It's pretty binary. Either we are there in this transition journey of our customers, and our customers are big players like Puma and Walmart, but also SMEs across Asia, Middle East, etc. So we have to be there in that journey. We have committed a significant amount of financial commitments in terms of these transition journeys. And we have said that we will be there with our customers in their transition journeys. So we are not saying that we are dropping our customers because there is a problem today. We are saying that we will work with you. We will help finance that journey of transition. So we have made that commitment already. The financial sector in most cases are making that commitment. But now what is required are 2 or 3 things to really scale it up. Number one, standardization. Today, it is happening in a manner which is very difficult to scale up. So today, yes, we can work with Walmart, we can work with Puma, we can work with others, etc., and that's fine. That's very good and that's very helpful. It's a very good agenda. But if we have to achieve scale for SMEs, for example, we need standards. So we're working with bodies like ICC, we're working with MAS, etc., to start creating standards in this space. So that's number one, standardization. Number two, we need, and Stephen sort of alluded to this already, we need the right level of understanding of this risk to enable the right capital treatment that is needed in this space to enable significant amount of financing. So that is the second thing that is required. The third thing, which is already starting to come in, and that is going to be an important enabler, is technology. So we have things like Internet of Things, we have blockchain. All of this now allows us significantly more transparency into the supply chain. So we can go much deeper into the supply chain. Earlier, banks would typically be in the tier 1, maximum tier 2 suppliers. But now, with Internet of Things and blockchain, we can go deeper and deeper into the supply chains, maybe right down to the farmers, to be able to finance the entire supply chain and not just the top end of the supply chain where a lot of banks were concentrated in, and which created a huge sort of trade finance gap. So I think that's the third piece. And the fourth is collaboration. So the work that we've done with for example, with ADB, at the height of COVID, where we worked on vaccine supply chains or PPE supply chains to enable those. I think that's the other framework that is there, which is required, public-private partnership frameworks, public side and private side coming together to enable the financing in a scalable manner. So in a nutshell, we are at the cusp of something quite big. So there is huge momentum behind this. There is business momentum, policy momentum, but to scale it up, we need these 3 or 4 things to come together and really scale up from here. And I think the financial sector doesn't have a choice. And we are very committed, definitely from a HSBC perspective in terms of our transition. Our CEO has made some significant commitments, which I can go to in more detail.
Thanks, Surath. DSG, you have your hand up.
Yeah, Chris, I want to thank Surath and also, of course, Stephen for that insight into financing and decarbonization. But I can assure you, on the ground, there's nervousness, I'll explain to you. I think one, while we hear the central bankers and the governors are coming together, even in ASEAN, we are coming together to come up with the framework taxonomy for sustainable finance. Up to now, I think their level of engagement with some of the affected sectors has been very low. Whether it's energy, whether it's agri, whether any other sector that's even transport that has a very huge carbon footprint, and these sectors need to transform. I think what I'm worried is at the end of the day, even if ASEAN lands on some sort of a taxonomy, you know how faithful the banks are. If the monetary authorities decide on a certain taxonomy, they'll be faithful to the dot. And from next year onwards or 2 years onwards down the road, when the taxonomy comes into force, immediately a whole chunk of industries and sectors are on our own. And you can imagine if we want, and technology hasn't caught up with many of them, you can't replace agriculture that much. Transport is transport, you can't replace it that much. And you can imagine at this stage is where, the need to deploy cleaner solutions, more efficient solutions, they're all in line with decarbonization. But again, would the financial sector be there to want to support? Would they have the appetite to want to be even associated, for example, to CCUS, the capturing of carbon from fossil thermal plants in Southeast Asia? It's a question mark, right? So I'm not sure. That's where my nervousness comes, and that's where a lot of the private sector that I hear from the CEOs are worried. They are worried that as we all move like a gangbang COP26, we see all the language everywhere in the media, all about what's good, what's great, and what's black and gray, and so all the coloring that's taking place. So I'm worried about the prejudice that's going to come and the inaccessibility of any kind of good quality financing to help the affected sectors to transform. So I'm not convinced at this stage, Chris. Yeah.
Thank you. One reason, of course, of having this sort of webinar today is to try and improve the level of engagement on these key topics and broaden some understanding. Surath, before I turn to Frank and Ronnie to give us some explanation of what they're doing, do you want to come back on what DSG just said?
Yeah, sure. I think, look, the concerns are valid. It's not an easy journey. So I wouldn't sort of just sit here and say, oh, it's all easy and it's done and we can just sort of dust our hands and move on. It's not. That's not the case, right? Let's be honest about it. And I speak with a significant number of SMEs and MSMEs in my day-to-day job, and they voice these concerns. So I cannot walk away from that. But there are two levels of things that are happening. Number one, which is the immediate, right? How do we immediately support these transitions? So post-COVID, what we've seen is a significant amount of our green financing or ESG financing, sustainable financing is going more towards the supplier base, which is the SME and MSME base, rather than the buyer-driven piece. So that is already starting to happen. And that is happening through various things, like we are looking at what the entire supply chain is, what is the transparency that new technology offers us. And there is other technologies like offsets, which are helping drive some of these things. But more clearly to Satinder's point, and he makes a very valid point, and is that we need to tackle this on a longer term basis. And longer term means a proper transition into cleaner tech, new ways of agriculture. For example, today, we are using certain qualities of rice. Is there a new way of planting rice so that there is less carbon capture, there is less water pollution in textile industry, etc., etc. And what we are doing there is that we are working with startups, with academic institutions, etc., funding research, seeding and putting investments into these startups, where these technologies are actually going to be significant enablers, lower cost enablers for these transitions. Because today what exists is a high cost transition plan, we need to help develop these low-cost transition plans as well. So on the one stage, in the shorter term, we are investing, we are working with our customers in their immediate transition plans and financing that. But we are also investing in these new technologies or supporting these new technologies, which will enable a much more lower cost transition for some of these sectors. And that is also very important, because this is not a one-pony trick.
Okay, thank you. Right, I think let's get into the meat of supply chain management and working with your suppliers as well. But we'll turn to Ronnie first and then Frank. We just heard a lot of issues being raised there: the need for standards, the need for better risk identification, better use of technology, increased collaboration. So I'll ask you both essentially the same question. Ronnie, please go first. Perhaps you can outline for us some of the ways in which you at Walmart and your company is ensuring sustainability in its supply chains, some of the key challenges you face, some of the lessons you're learning as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris, for inviting Walmart to this event. It is so wonderful to be part of this distinguished panel and going right into the discussion. I feel that this is really a timely meeting, considering the recently released IPCC report for United Nations and the upcoming COP26. Achieving ambitious climate and nature targets will require transformation from many parts of society, including transformation, as we talked about, around supply chains that produce the food, clothing, household items, and other things that people use in their daily lives. At Walmart, we have been collaborating across sectors, geographies, industries on sustainability for more than 16 years now. Our sustainability goals in 2005 included seeking to eliminate waste from our operations, transition to renewable energy, and sell more sustainable products. But we recognize this is not enough. Our natural systems are changing, and we must go beyond sustainability as it is understood and practiced today. So in September 2000, our CEO, Doug McMillon, raised Walmart's ambition by setting us on a path to become a regenerative company, one dedicated to placing nature and humanity at the center of our business practices. Regenerating means restoring, renewing, and replenishing in addition to conserving. It means adopting regenerative practices in agriculture, forests, fisheries management, and a circular approach to materials to eliminate waste while advancing prosperity and equity for customers, associates, and people that participate in the product supply chain. Together with this commitment, we also announced 2 goals on climate and nature. Firstly, targeting zero emissions by 2040 without relying on carbon offsets. Next, helping protect, manage, and restore 50 million acres of land and 1 million square miles of ocean by 2030, along with the Walmart Foundation. Both these goals purposefully intersect when we work to reduce emissions and we work on building local community resilience. We have made great progress in reducing emissions, establishing long-term partnerships with our key stakeholders, and investing in sustainable packaging and recycling technologies. For example, we were the first retailer to set and approve science-based target in 2016. More recently, in 2020, we aligned our science-based target to a 1.5 degrees Celsius trajectory, the highest ambition approved by the Science Based Targets Initiative. We have translated targets into operational goals for energy efficiency, renewable energy, transitioning refrigerants, converting our transportation to zero carbon solution, and others. This has been designed to deliver a more regenerative future and where our activities are helping conserve, replenish our planet, and give communities sustainable livelihoods. And let's talk about our suppliers. For our suppliers, we launched an effort called Project Gigaton in 2017. This is to help translate emission goal into practical actions in specific areas in their supply chains. It is easier for people to focus on operational changes and operating metrics that can be translated into estimates of emission impact. Through Project Gigaton, we have set a goal to reducing 1 billion metric tons of greenhouse gas emission from the global value chain by 2030. We are inviting our suppliers to set targets and to take action on 6 areas, namely energy, waste, packaging, nature, transportation, product use, and design. Today, I'm happy to share that more than 3,100 of our suppliers globally have signed on. Since the effort launched in 2017, our suppliers have reported over 416 million metric tons of emission avoided. We believe important reason for this level of progress is the case we made for positive business impact of climate change, and the support that we provide on goal setting, as well as some tools to enable progress. For example, we developed a sustainable packaging playbook as a tool that can help suppliers as they set goals for recyclable packaging and recycled content. On renewable energy, we now offer a way to accelerate the adoption by Walmart suppliers through combined power purchase agreements in collaboration with Schneider Electric. Walmart and Walmart Foundation have also invested in initiatives to facilitate progress on emission reductions across the global supply chain, such as the 2020 Global Forest Watch. This is the only publicly accessible global platform for monitoring deforestation. We intend to use our Project Gigaton platform to engage suppliers to better manage the production of critical commodities. This includes asking suppliers to adopt widely accepted certification. For example, Marine Stewardship Council, MSC for seafood, Forest Stewardship Council, FSC for pulp, paper, and timber, Roundtable for sustainable palm oil, RSPO for, of course, palm oil. I hope these examples demonstrate how we are committed to engaging our suppliers on these critical goals. For us, sustainability is embedded in our commitment to produce everyday true low-cost products.
Thanks, Ronnie. Ambitious targets there seem to be reaching right down to your furthest and most distant parts of your supply chain as well. Frank, same question to you. Perhaps you can outline for us the work that Puma are doing in this area.
Hey, let me first thank you for allowing me to participate in this panel. Let me give you some first background on what we are doing for those who are not so much into sports. Puma is a sports manufacturing company. I'm working there as a group treasurer, group insurer. We have had sales in 2020 of 5.2 billion, and we are the clear number 3 sportswear company in the world. Obviously, we have an ambition to number 2 because that's what my type of was. And the history is dating back in 1948, so more than 70 years ago. When it comes to the sports manufacturing industry, or even more to the fashion industry, we have to say that those industries are typically relying very much on their suppliers. That means when you look on the supply chain, typically design and functional specification stays with the companies like Puma. But when it comes to first samplings, when it comes to the production of the goods, this is typically, let me call it, outsourced to the suppliers, to external suppliers. These external suppliers are located by 95%, as it is the case with Puma, by 95% in Asia. So obviously, our suppliers are a real pivotal part of our supply chain, because Puma is then getting the finished goods only, let's say, and doing the distribution and marketing and the retail towards our end customers. Having said all that, we have to quite clearly team up with our suppliers in that regard. So how do we bring this sustainability targets? Because what is the background is, for me, I think the ESG linked supply chain finance, for me, shows the highest impact on the whole sustainability value chain of the industry, at least as it is the case for sports and fashion industry. But it really requires a quite intensive collaboration within the supply chain. Let me give you, let's say, 3 areas how we have done that with Puma, how we with Puma have connected a supply chain finance, ESG linked supply chain finance with sustainability target. First of all, let me give you a little bit of a background. As I said, Puma has outsourced, Puma and the industry has outsourced production towards these suppliers. As being a branded product, obviously you see our logo on our garment. Obviously, you see our logo on the apparel and everywhere on the shoes we wear. As a branded product, we have had the duty to take care what are the conditions, what are the production conditions at our supplier side. We could not close our eyes what's happening with that. And having said all that, that started much earlier than the sustainability drive, which we can see now in the last 10 years, let's say. That started much earlier in that regard. And that is when you look on the term ESG, so that is the social part, that is also the governance part in between. We have to take care about our suppliers, and that we have to take care that our suppliers are paying fair paying fair salaries towards their workers, because they are kind of, the consumer considers the way how we produce that as if it would be a pure Puma production. So we cannot close our eyes in that regard. So we are doing that quite early, and all our efforts have been concentrated since more than 20 years already in that area. So we have established systems how to do, well, not only checklists, but also on-site visits, and a kind of a consulting in that area, so that the way how our suppliers are producing our goods is a social and compliant one. And with the trend of also putting environmental aspects into that, which then brought to this term ESG, of course we have just, let's say, enriched what we have already built up for the social and governance part. And saying that is, today it is not the fact that the environmental aspect is a key business driver with Puma, but our consumers are expecting that we are producing our goods in a fair, honest, and also sustainable way. So that's what they expect. It's a kind of a hygienic factor. And being a brand, you have to be very careful with these hygienic factors, because if you don't comply with these hygienic factors, you can just be wiped out of business in that regard. So we have to take really a very good care in that regard. So whatever we have designed, also in supply chain finance, is a very, let's say, Puma unique way how we monitor all the different criteria. So it is very much customized to the production processes we have with our suppliers. The design power always lied with Puma, in particular, as it was the case with us, because when we designed this program, we call it Forever Better Financing Program for our suppliers, this is dating back to 2015. Our program, ESG-linked program, came onto the market in 2016. With that, we were the first sport industry supplier who launched such a program in the world. We were the first one who brought a private bank to also offer this program. So we are quite early in that regard. And in this, well, everybody has to rely on the system which was already implemented with Puma. This gives you a lot of design power. But of course, towards our suppliers, the targets have to be clear, communicated, widely accepted, and also acceptable. And that is what we can see now. And I think, Surat, you talked about a little bit when you said, hey, there is a need for standardization. It is nice to work with you guys and show you what are we doing. It is nice to show to the banks, hey, this is the way how Puma has designed sustainability. But this is a very customized thing. And if we want to scale it up, we have to get away from these customized things. And even if you look on the supplier side, it's not only these fulfilling all these criteria. We are setting up all these checklists, all these on-site visits. It is, of course, nice to have it, but it also consists of a burden. They have to fulfill that. They have to go through that. And if our competitor is knocking on their door, they maybe have a little bit of different checklists and different on-site visits. So this is really imposing also a burden and a cost effort on our suppliers. That's why this element, what Surat said, the standardization is so key. And that's where we have to work on that. And that's, for example, and that goes back to something what you said, Sadvinder, what we are also doing. We have to team up within the industry. So what we did in the fashion industry, where the sporting goods is also accounting to, what we did, we founded a kind of an industry-wide working group together with the United Nations. So it is the United Nations Fashion Charter for climate change. And here companies like Puma, but also its competitors, are working towards a sustainable framework where we also raise those concerns like you said, and where we are trying to standardize that for the industry, because this standardization is the key. Otherwise, banks would have to meet us where we have to learn, teach them how we are doing sustainability, and this is holding up the scalability. And that is what we really need to bring that to a common product.
Frank, if you don't mind, Chris, I just
yes, please do.
So Frank, who's best positioned to set those standards, do you think? I mean, we've had this discussion a number of times. Would you say it's industry by industry? That industry groups are best positioned to
it must be industry by industry. It must be industry by industry. And we have already seen, not from our industry, but we have already seen first industry who are trying to kind of find a standardized way in sustainability KPIs for their suppliers. The chemical industry is one of them who is trying to, and that is the purpose also from these working groups like our United Nations Fashion Charter, to really standardize that. They could not do it. They could not, well, they could find a way how to standardize that, but they have to team up with, and that is the topic which we have. And ESG is creating business opportunities, not only for you guys in the banks, but also for rating agencies. So you see more and more rating agencies, and they would be keen to do a kind of a standardization, maybe for the industry, so that they are then going towards the typical suppliers who work with us in the industry, and with the advantage that the supplier then does not have to undergo a Puma rating exercise, but a ESG rating agency exercise. And I think that is the way where we have to come. And this gives the supplier less effort to comply with those that. And also with us, frankly speaking, it's not our business purpose to do ESG ratings. We have just jumped into that because we have to do it specifically for the industry. So it's also, well, we can then concentrate on what creates value for us. And secondly, also, the rating agencies, they have a business opportunity, and that is the win-win-win situations we need.
Fascinating stuff. Actually, it brings me up. There's a question on the Q&A. I'm going off a bit off script here, guys. Sorry about that. There's a question on the Q&A from Gil Gonzalez, who's the Executive Director at the ASEAN Business Advisory Council. He says, happy to hear of Walmart's regenerative approach for its business, especially in aligning its supply chains to follow sustainable ways. But how do we replicate this and have more global companies follow such a lead? Is it through regulation, through incentives, through recognition and awards, or the formation of alliances? I think that follows on nicely from the discussion that Frank and Stephen were just having there then. And DSG, I'll come to you first. You want to have a stab at answering that, and bearing in mind, there's a role that ASEAN plays in terms of harmonizing standards across the region. You're on mute.
Yeah, Chris, let me take a stab at it. I think standards are extremely important, and one thing I'm clearly hear from each one of you, whether it's Walmart or Puma, and in part of our journey towards coming to carbon neutrality, I mean, in our journey, you will be engaging in many ways in carbon sinks, in carbon offsets, carbon credits initiatives. I think the issue today that's faced by a lot of businesses, the large businesses especially, who are very conscious of this now, but I think slowly but surely the SMEs are also going to need it. They all need to have this solution, is that how do we price the carbon? I think this is where the pricing of carbon is going to be one of the biggest issues, not just for ASEAN to look at, but also the whole world. And in our small attempt in the ASEAN, I think we have, at the Secretariat side, we are trying to develop some sort of a standardization, a measurement, reporting, and a verification system for carbon. But again, I know that that's just a bit, there's a bit naivety in that, because whatever you say, governments, I totally agree with many panelists. And at the end of the day, the industry, the market will have to decide for itself what the price of carbon is. And I think this is where we are also looking with some excitement in ASEAN, some exchanges that have actually started in carbon trading, and they are doing pretty active. They've been pretty active, and I think that's what I see. It has to come from ground up. The capital markets have the best discipline determining what the price of carbon is going to be, because until and unless we figure that out, that's going to be that sweetness that all of us need, the calculation that we all need in order to make those investments, and also to get the liquidity of funding for all the initiatives that we are thinking to do in all of our offsets, carbon credit initiatives, our carbon sinks. I think that's what kind of we all are looking forward to. But unfortunately, there isn't a commoditized price yet to carbon. But I think hopefully within the 10 years as we speak today, there will be something like that in making. I hope sooner. And that will then allow all of us to be able to then do what is right, and then have a financial discipline behind it that supports it, plus having the liquidity of capital markets support a lot of these initiatives. But at the same time, nothing is stopping us. Like I said, the Secretary is looking at some of these standardizations, but honestly, it's not that easy. It's not easy because it's so, you're dealing with a whole many industry sectors as you speak. So as you sit down there and try to figure out measurement reporting standards for, and my feeling is that each industry has to take its own leadership. Each association group globally will have to figure out its own rules. And honestly, you're not going to have one single standard that's going to cover all products and all industries and services. It's really going to be as complex as we see today for everything else in international trade. So that's my stake at it.
You're on mute, Chris.
Sorry, yeah, Frank, you had your hand up just then. Did you want to jump in?
Well, only with a short comment, because I do believe in price tags. That's what you said, Satvinder. But I don't think the stick will do it alone. We also need carrots. So it must be carrot and sticks, and that's why we have to find with the industry ways, and also with the good support of the financial institutions, ways also to find incentives in that regard to comply with what I described before with my win-win-win situation. For me, it is carrot and sticks.
Well, Frank, if I may just to hop in there, I mean, I think that's the beauty of a price signal. I think to Satinder's point, is that there is a carrot and a stick with a lower price or a higher price, right? So if it's considered green and clean, then you're going to pay a lower price. Well, theoretically anyway. And certainly that's the case. What I was mentioning earlier about tying risk in a transaction from a financial point of view, tying risk to regulatory capital. And if you can make that link, which isn't easy, but if you can make that link, and we have to go there, then the cleaner the transaction, the cheaper it is, and that's a pretty good carrot.
Okay. I think Frank and Ronnie both talked about the depth of SMEs in their supply chains, and you can't ignore them on this. And it's all well and good companies setting standards, what they want their SMEs and their supply chains to abide by. But the issue comes down to how can we help finance those SMEs to make sure that they meet those requirements going forward, and that the supply chains truly are sustainable. I want to, Sarath, if you want to give us some of your viewpoints on that, and perhaps Stephen, you want to jump in with some of the things that ADB's been working on as well.
So thanks, Chris. I think it's very important, right, for SMEs, and I think Frank also spoke about this. I mean, some of these SMEs are pure suppliers of one or two corporates. Sometimes they are suppliers of multiple corporates, and you cannot have a situation where they are having to meet significant standards which have shifted and are continuously shifting for them, because it comes at a cost for them. And we have SME and MSME associations speaking speaking to us about exactly this, that how do we comply with these standards? And first of all, what are these standards and why are they different for different buyers? So I was hearing my co-panelists saying, and to an extent I agree that this has to be driven industry by industry. But to an extent, I also feel that there is a lot of overlap in a lot of these standards that can be created across industry sectors. So we need not have different sectors for different standards for how you measure water pollution, for example. That happens across different sectors. That doesn't happen in one sector. I'm just using that as an example. But we need to help change this, and that standardization has to work. So that financing at scale through standardization has to come across sectors. And I believe that industry bodies will have to come together to create this chambers of commerce. I mean, people like the International Chamber of Commerce, which is ICC, where a lot of the sectors actually sit, have to come together along with banking or other investors. So that's one. Secondly, I think risk sharing between public and private bodies to enable SMEs to access finance is very important. How do we create that format continuously, right? So private sector is hugely committed here. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think it sometimes feels like, when is this money going to come? The private sector is hugely committed. We have committed 750 to 1 trillion of investments and financing in this area to help our customers over the next 10 years. So it's a huge commitment that we are putting, and similarly other institutions are putting there as well. But it cannot be done single-handedly by the private sector, or for that matter anyone, but public-private partnership, creating risk-sharing mechanisms is very, very important to enable SMEs there. And it does two things, right? One is it allows for the risk to be shared in an equitable manner. But secondly, it also allows us to reach SMEs which are otherwise untouched by some of this financing, because some of the public money can actually help go there as well. And the third most important one is continue to innovate in financial products. The financial products, and what do I mean by that? The financial products that we have today are fantastic. They have served a purpose and they continue to serve a purpose, but that's not enough to take us into our next level of financing that is required for this huge transition journey. Supply chains account for 80% of a company's carbon footprint, and this is mostly SMEs and MSMEs. So that transition, if it has to happen, it has to happen through innovation. We have to look at different ways of financing. So the third element is this innovative financial products, where we can bring in capital market and other investors as well into this in a much more robust manner. Into the trade supply chain part of it is also very important. So the facilitating that money to flow in to support the SMEs and MSMEs, which is again something which is very, very important. So standardization, risk sharing between public and private, and innovative products to help access capital investor money into the transition of supply chains. These three things, I think, are going to be absolutely paramount.
Thanks, Stephen. The viewpoint from ADB, do you agree with what Sarath just said? I know you guys have been doing a fair amount of work in this space across Asia.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with what Sarath has mentioned, especially with respect to the tech. We need to make it accessible. We need to develop and innovate more mechanisms to be able to monitor and verify ESG in the throughout the supply chains. And to link that to something that Satinder was referring to earlier, I mean, the danger with implementing these kinds of things is that one leaves behind the SMEs, especially the smaller firms that have they're struggling to begin with, and then suddenly they're being asked to take on something huge that may represent a significant amount of investment, and they don't have access to the support to make that kind of a transition. So there is that danger. We have to be very careful that we don't leave these guys behind, because of course they're critical to economies in ASEAN and elsewhere. So we've been training some of our partner banks in ESG, particularly those banks that do tend, the smaller banks in our developing member countries that tend to more often support SMEs. We're also in the process of implementing ESMS systems into our partner banks in our developing member countries, including ASEAN. We're about to come out with a due diligence questionnaire that focuses on the labor practices. And we're going to be introducing those to our banks later on this year, and then implementing them, meaning that we're going to ask our partner banks in our developing member countries to use those with their clients. So anyway, so there are a number of things we're trying to do. Training is very important, information is very important, and we need to ensure that the SMEs are not left behind and have the ability to make the transition. Thanks.
Thanks, Ronnie. I'll come to you on the similar topic, actually. Perhaps you can just explain more about the work that Walmart does with the financial institutions that you work with to help make sure the guys in your supply chains get the investments they need to meet your sustainability demands.
Yeah, happy to talk about that. Since 2019, Walmart is collaborating with HSBC in its Sustainable Supply Chain Finance Program. This program allows suppliers that demonstrate progress in the Sustainability Index, also known as TSIS, powered by the Sustainability Consortium's measurement and reporting system, or through Walmart's Project Gigaton, to apply for improved financing from HSBC. This program helps to reduce suppliers' borrowing costs. Walmart typically has a higher credit rating than most of our suppliers, so they can take advantage of our credit rating by discounting receivables from Walmart. The tiered pricing model is tied to suppliers' sustainability performance and ratings. This prioritizes access to low-cost financing for suppliers if they demonstrate progress in reducing their emissions. With this, suppliers will be able to invest in sustainability-linked projects such as energy efficiency improvements, renewables, sustainable packaging innovations, and others. In August this year, we expanded the HSBC partnership to include social component of sustainability. Now working with C2FO, the program provides certified diverse minority suppliers with convenient and consistent access to reliable funding sources. The global collaboration we have with HSBC demonstrates both companies' leadership in shaping transition to a lower emission world. In many cases, Project Gigaton is a reflection of our perspective on collective action with our suppliers. I would like to talk a bit about Walmart's recent green bond offering. Last month, Walmart announced that we closed the previously announced $2 billion inaugural green bond offering. Net proceeds will be allocated to fund current and prospective projects to advance Walmart's sustainability goals. Over the next few years, we intend to allocate an amount equal to the net proceeds of the $2 billion offering toward a portfolio of eligible green investments within the areas of renewable energy, high-performance buildings, sustainable transport, zero waste, circular economy, water stewardship, habitat restoration, and conservation.
Thanks, Ronnie. Okay, we're heading towards the end of our time. There's one question on the Q&A which I'm going to throw to all of you, and I'll ask DSG to answer it first, and then perhaps maybe Frank after that. It is, what are the concrete actions to implement transparency in innovation and digitalization? All of these come at a cost, and who bears them? Many businesses in ASEAN are MSMEs with little access to finance. So how can we ensure companies comply with these requirements, particularly over transparency, and other than through reputational risk? DSG, you want to have a stab at this one first? I mean, you opened up talking about the importance of digitization.
Yeah, so I would say digitalization is important, and honestly, today the cost of digitalizing is not the same as what it used to be 15 years ago. So, because of cloud and because of onboarding the huge amount of capacities today, even in ASEAN, I think the cost is not the same. It's much lower. I think today it's really about on the ground, the attitudes of the bureaucrats, the attitudes of the officials, the attitudes of what you get at the regulator point of view. I think a bit of stick is more necessary today in the adoption of digitalization. And until the stick comes, it's going to be quite difficult, because today is not about cost. Technology is there. It's not about technology solutions. They're all there. Today is really about whether there's a will to actually transform what happens on the ground. And because there's so much of interest in order to maintain that opaqueness, not to bring about transparency in the entire value chain of trade, you will see this battle that keeps happening. I mean, honestly, we should have been more digitalized 20 years ago. But because of the inherent interests of everyone involved in the whole value process of trade, some of this still remains opaque. Everybody is trying to protect its own segment of the value chain of international trade. So I think that's where the problem is. So it's not about our ability today. It's not about cost of doing, but I think today, collectively, if truly we all believe that we can make it transparent and we can get the whole value chain to work together while keeping each of the value chains participation in preservation. We don't kick people out in the whole value chain, the brokers, intermediaries, and everybody in the value chain, then I think we have a chance. If we think that we're going to set up one platform and disintermediate the whole value chain in trade, when I hear that, I always run away from that conversation, because it's not going to happen. Okay, you're not dealing with reality on the ground. That's one. I think the other thing, Stephen, I just want to address the translation issues, and I want to thank ADB for doing the hard work of also building our capabilities of the banks, and especially the ASEAN banks. There's a need for a huge amount of capacity building so that all of these decarbonization projects can get the life of the day. I still see there's still a very high risk associated to those projects, and the will for many of these investment bankers or even these bankers to want to come forward to support this project is still not easy. I've met many of the decarbonization project owners, and they all keep telling me the frustration. They know what they're doing. They've been doing this for 30 years. They can't get $5 million. They can't get $2 million. So you keep hearing, they're not even asking 200 million. You keep hearing all this frustration on the ground. And I think the translation is not just with the banks. I think we need to also have capacity building for the entire value chain of professionals involved in translation of key projects, the financing of projects, the bankability of projects. So the lawyers, the accountants, and even consultants. And I think that's where I think we are all in a journey together. And I think everyone's help in this will be much appreciated. And that's how we are going to move along positively.
Thanks. Frank, what's your viewpoint?
Well, let me take out 2 or 3 key points you said. Let's start with digitization. Digitization is, of course, more than just a digital signature. Nice to have, but it's more. It is a really digital supply chain from order to cash for our suppliers. That's why we at Puma have connected all of our suppliers with a third-party sourcing platform. And here also buyers like Puma or others, it's not an industry-specific thing, have to be honest. If we connect our suppliers to, let's say, own platforms which we develop, well, we are putting an extra burden on them. So we have to really rely on third-party platforms where also maybe other competitors are on, so that we get a kind of a more standard with that. It doesn't help to put an EDI link only from my operations towards the supplier operations. It has to be a kind of a standardization also in platforms. So we relied from the very beginning on a third-party platform, and this brings, and that is so important, and this brings all information onto that platform. It starts with a purchase order, it goes towards the acceptance of this purchase order, to a forecasted delivery date, to a confirmed delivery date, to a shipment note, to a blah, 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 blah. So everything is on that platform. And when you have everything on that platform, and when you have a certain history on that platform, another thing comes up. This is the treasure of data. This is the treasure of data with a history. Then you can start to work with the history and really can show towards your environment, hey, what is the history with this supplier? What is the history? Have they been punctual in delivery? Have they been compliant when it comes to quality and in that regard? And I think we have to work very much more also to make use of this data, because this data, like the performance of a supplier was with Puma, could be a topic which could be also interested for those who are working and lending money towards our suppliers. Because this is not a data which is dated into the past. It is kind of a data which is constantly growing, where you can have online business and where you can see also future businesses, because every purchase order is a future businesses. And you will not find it in the P&L and balance sheet, a purchase order. You will only see it in these systems. And that is where we really have to innovate on, to make use of that data, to make it easier for our suppliers to get the financing, because they have a proof of business that this is coming. And with a cancellation rate of purchase orders, they have also a proof of history with that business which is coming with buyers like Puma. And that should be the data which we are using and which is also reducing the risk for our lending partners. And we are working actively on that, because then we can really also find a better access to risk for the SME partners, because that is something what you again would not see in P&L and balance sheet. And here we have to really work on that and find ways how to make use of that data. And I think that's where really the beauty of collaboration lies.
Thank you, Frank. Okay, I've got one last question, which I'm going to direct towards DSG, Satvinder, and to Stephen and Sarath. You may have different answers on it, but I think it all falls into your area. We spoke earlier about the need for standards on sustainable finance. When can we actually see this materializing? An ASEAN-wide taxonomy, DSG? You're on mute.
Yes, on the financial sustainability taxonomy, it's actually in the works. As we speak today, I believe the committee that's looking at it is going to be finalizing the findings, and they are presenting it to the leaders' meetings, the findings, and then the launch of that taxonomy apparently is going to happen at COP26 this year in November. So watch out for it. So there is some work in that light already. I'm sure at some point there will be public consultation on the taxonomy, and then from there, hopefully we all can provide our inputs, more thorough inputs at the sectoral level to the ASEAN financial taxonomy. I'll stop there.
Marvelous news. Stephen, Sarath, want a quick stab? What do you think is going to happen on standards for sustainable finance?
Yeah, I'll jump in. As Sarath knows, the International Chamber of Commerce, the Asian Development Bank, was on the committee helping to steer an effort to define the taxonomy, what constitutes a green trade finance guarantee, a green trade finance loan, compared with one that's not green. So that work has now been picked up by the Boston Consulting Group, which is, I'm not sure what the date is that they're going to be producing the report for the International Chamber of Commerce, but it's soonish, to be specific. And then I think it would make a lot of sense, obviously, for the ICC guys to team up with the ASEAN guys and compare notes, maybe sooner rather than later. So there's that, and then the plan was that once we have the taxonomy, then we contact the regulators to do what I was mentioning before, to link that what a green transaction is to regulatory capital and try to drive lower prices for financing for green initiatives.
Excellent. And Sarath.
Yeah, I think I'm actually on the optimistic side of this one, right? So I look at this as, if I look at trade, and I'm a big history student of trade, so I look at a big moment in trade was containerization of trade when containers actually came in. That was the first standards in trade, right? So once suddenly you had these containers and your shipping costs, your insurance costs all came down and your total cost of trade came down by 70–80%. So that was a big moment in the 1930s. I think this is the next big moment around that. And there is a lot of work that is going on. And I agree on both on the ASEAN side, on the ICC side, and ICC is a big, we are involved there along with ADBs to sort of help chart that. And I'm very optimistic that that should come out fairly quickly around what the standards are. But what we should be careful about, the only thing that I would sort of raise a caution, is that we don't create islands of standards that do not interact with each other. That will be the worst sort of result out of all of this. So we almost need to collaborate, and I think Stephen sort of started alluding to this, collaborate across these associations. And all of you are doing great work, but we need to collaborate to make sure that we come up with one set of standards, or not multiple set of standards, which will make things worse from what they are. So great momentum behind it. Very optimistic that this will come through fairly quickly.
Okay, thank you very much. That brings us to the end. Thank you, gentlemen. It's a fascinating discussion. Could have carried on for even longer, but we're all very, very busy people. I would sum this up by basically, I'll go back to, I can't remember who said it, but there are four things. There are standards, and those standards are for financial part of the equation, but also indeed for how you're going to work with suppliers and supply chains and how we're going to approach different issues connected with sustainability. Is the risk element as well, about how we apportion the risk, work with risk, and how the big firms work with their SMEs around risk areas. Technology, of course, plays a major part in this. It's going to allow us more and more to monitor what's going on, how suppliers are acting in the systems. We use blockchain. We have the systems that Frank was mentioning earlier. But lastly, and I think most of all came out of this discussion, it's collaboration. It needs collaboration within industry, across sectors, with government, with financial institutions, with your suppliers, and perhaps also indeed from consumers at the end of the day, because they're the ones who will be voting with their feet or with their wallets. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining this. Thank you for you that stayed online in Europe and here in Asia. I hope you all keep safe and well, and I hope we can do this in person at some point in the not too distant future as well. So thank you very much.
Anytime, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.